13 years. She let me believe it for 13 years.
Malik sat on the floor of his home office at 11 at night, an old laptop that had belonged to his wife propped open on his knees, trying to recover a folder of childhood photos for his daughter's school project. He wasn't looking for anything else. He found it anyway, a folder buried 3 layers deep, named nothing in particular, containing photos he recognized instantly and had never once questioned in 13 years. Except these weren't the photos he remembered. These were the originals. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. What Malik found on that laptop would end his marriage before sunrise. But to understand why, you have to go back more than a decade, to 2 sisters who were never supposed to want the same thing. Maya and Vanessa grew up 2 years apart in a house where comparison was the water they swam in without ever noticing it was there. Maya was the older one, steady and a little guarded, the kind of kid who did her homework before anyone asked and rarely needed to be told twice. Vanessa was the one who charmed teachers into extensions and charmed their mother into second chances, quick with a smile that got her out of things Maya never even tried to get out of. Their parents called it personality. Maya, by the time she was a teenager, had a quieter word for it, one she never said out loud. Favoritism, dressed up as personality. There was a specific memory Maya carried from when she was 15 and Vanessa 13. A school talent show where Maya had spent 6 weeks learning a violin piece, practicing every evening until her fingers ached, only for their mother to spend the entire car ride home talking about how naturally Vanessa had picked up a dance routine in 2 rehearsals for her own act the following week. Maya never mentioned that memory to anyone, not even Vanessa, but she carried it the way people carry small, specific proof of something larger they can't quite name. Evidence filed away for a case she never expected to actually need to argue. There was another memory too, one Maya thought about less often, but that surfaced, unbidden, at odd moments for years afterward. The summer she was 17 and got into her first choice university early, a genuine achievement she'd worked toward for 2 years, only to watch the celebration dinner their parents threw quietly reroute, halfway through dessert, into a conversation about Vanessa's upcoming driver's test, as though the room could only hold one daughter's accomplishment at a time, and had simply, instinctively, chosen. Maya didn't resent Vanessa for any of this. Not exactly. She understood, even as a teenager, that the imbalance wasn't something Vanessa had engineered on purpose, not back then. But she understood something else too, something that would matter enormously years later. That Vanessa had grown up watching the same dynamic from the opposite angle, absorbing far more attention than she'd ever had to work for, and that neither sister had ever once talked honestly with the other about what that lopsided arrangement was quietly doing to both of them. They weren't close in the way people mean when they call sisters close, but they weren't enemies either, not for most of their lives. There was a wary, watchful kind of love between them, the kind built by 2 people who'd spent childhood being measured against each other by everyone else in the room. It held, mostly, through their 20s, separate cities, separate lives, the occasional holiday dinner where old patterns resurfaced for an evening and then got packed away again until the next one. Vanessa moved for a job right out of college and came home twice a year. Maya stayed close to their parents, which somehow, in the strange arithmetic of families, never seemed to count for as much as it should have. Maya met Malik at 26, at a mutual friend's rooftop birthday party she'd almost skipped. He was the kind of calm that read as solid rather than boring, a structural engineer who talked about bridges with a genuine, unembarrassed enthusiasm that Maya found, against her own expectations, completely disarming. They talked for 2 hours that night about nothing important and everything that mattered, and by the time she got home she'd already texted her best friend that she thought she'd just met someone. Their first real date was a walk through a botanical garden neither of them had been to before, 3 hours that felt like 30 minutes. Malik explaining the engineering behind a suspension footbridge on the property with the same enthusiasm he'd shown at the party. Maya realizing somewhere around the 2nd hour that she'd stopped performing the version of herself she usually brought to first dates and had simply, without deciding to, relaxed into being herself. He noticed things about her that most people didn't bother to. The way she went quiet when she was actually listening instead of waiting to talk. the small furrow that appeared between her eyebrows when she was working through a design problem in her head, even at a party. By their third date, she'd stopped comparing him to anyone who'd come before. She had. They dated for 3 years before he proposed, on a weekday evening, on the walking bridge near their apartment where they'd had their first real conversation about moving in together, with a ring he'd been carrying around in his coat pocket for 2 weeks waiting for a moment that felt right instead of staged. Maya said yes before he finished the sentence. She called Vanessa that same night, breathless, and Vanessa said all the right things. "Congratulations. When do we get to meet him properly? I'm so happy for you." In a voice that Maya, looking back years later, would remember as just slightly too smooth, too rehearsed, like a performance she hadn't noticed as a performance at the time. Vanessa met Malik for the first time at a family dinner 2 weeks after the engagement, and something in the room shifted in a way nobody named out loud that night. Vanessa was warmer to him than she typically was to strangers, asked more questions than the moment called for, about his work, his family, his 5-year plan, questions that felt, to their mother, like simple enthusiasm for a new addition to the family, and laughed a beat too long at things that weren't especially funny. Malik, unaware he was being evaluated, thought nothing of it, told Maya on the drive home that he liked her sister, that she seemed genuinely excited for them. Maya noticed the undertone anyway, filed it away the way she'd filed away small things about Vanessa her entire life, and told herself it was nothing. She had spent her whole life being the sister who didn't make a scene. She wasn't going to start over a dinner. The months that followed were, by Maya's own account later, some of the happiest of her life. Apartment hunting for a place they'd share after the wedding, a guest list that kept growing every time either of them remembered one more person who mattered, dress fittings with her mother that turned into entire afternoons neither of them wanted to end. Vanessa came to 2 of those fittings, offered opinions Maya mostly took, seemed, from the outside, like exactly the sister she was supposed to be during a season like that one. At the second fitting, Vanessa had teared up watching Maya step out in the dress they'd eventually choose, and Maya, looking back on that moment years later with the full weight of everything she'd since learned, still couldn't fully decide whether those tears had been real. If anything had shifted underneath the surface by then, nothing in her behavior gave it away. Malik, for his part, spent those months finishing the design work on a footbridge project he'd been assigned lead engineer for, coming home most evenings with rolled-up drawings and an energy Maya found infectious even when she didn't fully understand the technical details. He'd taken to calling it our bridge, half joking, though Maya suspected some part of him meant it. A structure he was building at the exact same time he was building a life with her, both projects requiring, in his mind, the same careful, patient attention to a foundation nobody would ever see once it was finished. The wedding was 8 months out when everything fell apart. Maya had gone to visit an old college friend for a weekend, someone Malik had never met, staying at his apartment because the friend's own place was being renovated. It was meant to be an easy, uneventful trip, 2 old friends who hadn't seen each other in years, catching up over takeout, wandering through a farmer's market on the Saturday morning, nothing that would have registered as remarkable to anyone watching from a normal distance. Nothing happened that weekend beyond 2 old friends catching up over takeout and a rewatch of a show they both loved in college. Vanessa knew about the trip. Maya had mentioned it casually weeks earlier, the way you mention any plan to a sister who asks. Vanessa also, it turned out, knew the friend's roommate, a coincidence Maya wouldn't understand the size of until years later, and arranged, through a conversation she later described to that roommate as just messing with my sister a little, to have a set of photos taken outside the apartment that weekend. Maya laughing on a stoop with her friend's arm loosely around her shoulders, the kind of photo that means absolutely nothing in context and everything without it. The photos arrived in Malik's inbox 2 days after Maya got home, sent from an account with no name attached, no message beyond a single line. Thought you should see this before the wedding, not after. Malik stared at the photos for what felt to him, recounting it later, like an hour, but was probably closer to 10 minutes. Cycling through explanations that all sounded thin against the particular, deliberate angle of the shot, close enough to read as intimate, distant enough that no context accompanied it. He didn't call Maya to ask about them. He called Vanessa instead, without fully understanding why she was the first person he thought to call. Some instinct, he'd tell himself later, toward the person who'd seemed most invested in their happiness at that family dinner months earlier. And Vanessa listened to him fall apart on the phone with a steadiness that felt, to him in that moment, like the only solid ground left in the room. She didn't tell him the photo meant what it looked like it meant. She was too careful for that. She simply said, gently, that she didn't know what to think either, that she hated seeing him hurt like this, that she wished she had answers for him. A performance of neutrality that did more damage than an outright accusation would have, because it let Malik arrive at the worst conclusion entirely on his own. Maya never got the chance to properly explain, not because Malik refused to listen, but because by the time she understood what he was even accusing her of, he'd already decided. He broke off the engagement over the phone, voice cracking in a way that told her this wasn't cruelty so much as genuine, wounded belief. "I saw the photo," he kept saying, as though the photo itself were an argument that didn't require further evidence. She asked him to just tell her what he thought he'd seen. He read her a description of it instead of sending it, and she felt something drop through the floor of her stomach, recognizing instantly what weekend he meant and understanding, in the same breath, that she had absolutely no idea how a photo like that could exist. She sent him the actual context, her friend's name, the roommate, dates, anything she could think of to prove the photo was nothing. He didn't respond that night or the next day. Someone, she would only understand years later, had gotten to him first and gotten there convincingly. And by the time her explanation reached him, it was competing against a version of events he'd already spent 2 full days grieving. She called Vanessa the night it happened, sobbing, asking for the one thing she thought she could still count on, her sister showing up. Vanessa came over that night with wine and tissues and every appearance of solidarity. Sat with Maya until 2 in the morning saying all the right things about how Malik would come to his senses, how men panicked and made mistakes, how Maya deserved better than a man who wouldn't even let her explain. Maya believed every word of it. She had no reason not to. What Maya didn't see, in the weeks that followed, was Vanessa quietly becoming the person Malik leaned on to process the breakup. A coffee here, a check-in call there, all of it framed, to him, as a concerned future sister-in-law trying to hold a fracturing family together. Their first coffee, 3 weeks after the broken engagement, lasted 2 hours, most of it Malik talking through his confusion and grief, while Vanessa listened with an attentiveness he hadn't realized he'd been missing. She never once brought up the photo directly. She let him do that work, offering just enough gentle validation. "Of course you're hurting, of course this is hard. Nobody would blame you for how you reacted," to keep him circling the same conclusion without ever having to argue for it herself. It didn't look like anything. That was the point. The calls became more frequent over the following months, then the coffees, then dinner once, framed as an accident of both their schedules landing on the same free evening. There was a particular afternoon, about 4 months in, when Vanessa drove 2 hours to sit with Malik after a difficult week at work, arriving unannounced with takeout from a restaurant he'd once mentioned in passing months earlier, a level of attentiveness that struck him, at the time, as simply thoughtful rather than calculated. He told her that evening that he didn't know what he would have done without her these past months, a sentence Vanessa carried home with her and thought about for days afterward, turning it over the way a person turns over something they've wanted to hear for a long time without ever quite admitting it to themselves. By the time it became something, 6 months later, when Vanessa and Malik admitted to each other what had been building underneath all those check-ins, it had happened slowly enough that neither of them, in the moment, seemed to fully register how it looked from the outside. Malik would say later that he never once, in those 6 months, consciously thought of it as anything but comfort from a family member who understood what he'd lost. Vanessa, if she thought of it any differently, never let it show. Maya found out about the 2 of them from their mother, delivered gently, apologetically, in a phone call their mother clearly dreaded making. Their mother had found out herself only days earlier, at a dinner where Vanessa and Malik arrived together without warning, and had spent the drive home. She admitted to Maya later, trying to figure out how to tell her older daughter something that felt less like family news and more like a betrayal she hadn't personally committed but somehow still felt responsible for delivering. "I don't understand it either," her mother said, more than once during that call, a sentence Maya would remember years later as the truest thing her mother said to her during the entire ordeal, because at the time, none of them understood it, not the full shape of it, not yet. Maya didn't scream. She didn't confront anyone. She sat very still in her apartment for a long time afterward, turning over a feeling she couldn't fully name yet, something colder and more specific than grief, though she wouldn't have been able to say why at the time. She simply stopped calling Vanessa after that, stopped attending the family gatherings where she knew Vanessa and Malik might be, and rebuilt a version of her life that didn't have room for either of them in it. Vanessa and Malik married a year and a half after the photos arrived in his inbox, a small ceremony their parents attended and Maya did not. Maya sent a card. She didn't go. Their mother told her later that Vanessa had cried during the vows, and Maya, hearing that secondhand years afterward, would wonder what exactly those tears had actually been for. Their father walked Vanessa down a short garden aisle at a venue Maya had once, years earlier, mentioned wanting for her own wedding, a detail their mother never brought up and Maya never asked about, though she noticed it anyway in a handful of photos that made their way to her regardless. The marriage that followed looked, from the outside, entirely ordinary. 2 kids, a house in a good school district, the kind of life that photographs well at holidays. Malik built a career, coached his son's soccer team on weekends, took his daughter to father-daughter dances he'd circle on the calendar weeks in advance, never once suspected that the photo that had ended his first engagement had been anything other than exactly what it appeared to be. There were good years in that marriage, plenty of them. Vanessa was, by most accounts, a devoted mother and a present partner, quick to plan family trips and remember birthdays and show up for the small, unglamorous work of keeping a household running. Whatever she'd done to get there, she didn't seem to spend the following decade thinking about it. She'd built something and, having built it, simply lived inside it. Vanessa, for her part, settled into a life she had actively engineered with a completeness that, over a decade, made the original engineering easy to forget had ever happened at all, even, in quieter moments, to herself. On the rare occasions the 2 sisters found themselves in the same room, holidays their parents still insisted on hosting jointly, Vanessa was warm and easy in a way that never once suggested guilt, and Maya, unable to prove anything beyond an old, unshakable instinct, learned to sit through those dinners with a practiced, careful distance that nobody else at the table seemed to notice. Maya rebuilt slowly, the way people do after something takes the ground out from under them without warning. She moved to a different part of the city, took a studio apartment with bare walls she told herself she'd decorate eventually and never quite did, and threw herself into work in a way that read, to people who didn't know the full story, like admirable ambition rather than avoidance. She built a career in architecture that she was good at and increasingly proud of, made partner at her firm 9 years after the broken engagement, designed a community library that got written up in a regional magazine with her name in the byline. She dated occasionally without ever quite letting anyone in past a certain point, a pattern one boyfriend eventually named out loud before ending things, telling her she seemed to be waiting for something she never explained, and she didn't correct him because she wasn't entirely sure he was wrong. She wasn't unhappy. That was the part she would have insisted on if anyone had asked. She had a life that worked, friends who knew a version of the story without ever getting the specifics, a rhythm to her days that mostly kept the old grief at a manageable distance. She simply carried an unresolved question she'd stopped expecting anyone to answer for her. Why? Out of everyone in the world, the one photo used to end her engagement had needed a coincidence as specific as her sister knowing the exact right roommate to reach. She'd turned that question over so many times across so many years that it had worn smooth, less a wound by then than a habit of mind, something she visited occasionally the way people revisit an old address they used to live at, out of reflex more than need. 13 years passed before the laptop cracked it open. Malik had kept it in a drawer since Vanessa upgraded years earlier, mostly forgotten, until their daughter needed old family photos for a school project, and he went digging for them himself rather than bother his wife with it. He wasn't looking for anything beyond birthday parties and beach trips. What he found instead, buried in an unlabeled folder inside another unlabeled folder, was a set of unedited originals from that weekend 13 years earlier. The full, uncropped photos, taken from 3 separate angles, clearly staged rather than caught candidly, along with a text thread between Vanessa and a name he didn't recognize, thanking him for playing along that weekend. and confirming a payment of $200 for acting like her friend's roommate for 5 minutes. Malik read that thread 4 times before he fully understood what he was looking at. Then he sat on the floor of his office for a long time, the laptop's glow the only light in the room, doing arithmetic on his own life that he'd never once thought he'd need to do. 13 years, 2 children, a marriage built. He now understood with a clarity that made him physically sick, on a lie his own wife had constructed and then spent over a decade quietly letting him believe. He scrolled back through the thread again, checking the dates against his own memory, confirming what some small, disbelieving part of him kept hoping he'd misread. The messages were sent 4 days before the photos landed in his inbox, meaning the entire sequence had been planned in advance, not improvised in the moment the way he'd have almost preferred to imagine. He thought about calling his brother, the one person who might talk him through what to do next, and decided against it, unwilling yet to say the words out loud to anyone. He thought about waking Vanessa right then, laptop in hand, demanding an answer at 1 in the morning, and decided against that too. Some instinct telling him he needed to understand the full shape of what he was looking at before he said anything he couldn't take back. He closed the laptop eventually, sat in the dark for a while longer, and went to bed beside a woman he realized, lying there in the dark, he might not actually know at all. He didn't confront Vanessa that night. He barely spoke to her for 3 days, citing a work deadline that didn't exist, sleeping in the guest room under the excuse of not wanting to disturb her early mornings. Those 3 days passed in a strange, disorienting fog. He went to work, sat through meetings, drove his son to soccer practice, performing the ordinary motions of his life, while an entirely different version of it sat unresolved in his chest. He caught himself, more than once, watching Vanessa across the dinner table with their children between them, trying to reconcile the woman pouring milk into their son's cereal with the 26-year-old who had paid a stranger $200 to help end her own sister's engagement, and finding, each time, that the 2 images simply refused to sit comfortably in the same person. What he actually spent those 3 days doing, beyond the fog of ordinary life, was finding Maya, a search that took less effort than he expected, given how carefully he'd avoided ever looking her up in the 13 years since. He found her firm's website, her professional email, a photo of her at a ribbon cutting for a building she'd designed, looking exactly like herself and also, somehow, like someone he'd never actually gotten the chance to know. He wrote the email 4 times before sending a version he was satisfied with, one that didn't ask for forgiveness or try to explain itself in the subject line, one that simply said he needed to show her something and would understand completely if she deleted it without reading further. Maya almost did delete it. She recognized his name immediately, felt her stomach drop in a way she hadn't expected after 13 years of telling herself she'd moved past needing an explanation. She opened it anyway, some old, unresolved part of her unable to resist the one thing she'd never got. The truth, finally, from the one person who actually owed it to her. They met at a coffee shop neither of them had any history with, neutral ground neither had chosen for sentimental reasons. Maya arrived early and sat facing the door, watching it every time it opened, rehearsing and discarding a dozen different versions of how this conversation might go. When Malik walked in, older than the version of him she still carried in her memory, a little grayer at the temples, he hesitated for a second at the sight of her before crossing the room, and something in that hesitation told her this wasn't going to be the kind of conversation either of them had fully prepared for. He didn't say much by way of introduction. He sat down, ordered nothing, and set the laptop on the table between them. "I need you to see something," he said, "and I need you to know I only found it 3 days ago." "I didn't know. I want to say that first, before anything else. I didn't know." He turned the screen toward her and let the unedited photos and the text thread speak for themselves, watching her face as she read it, understanding, in real time, exactly how much of her life had been quietly rewritten by a lie he'd been too devastated to question 13 years earlier. Maya read the thread twice, hands steady in a way that surprised her, given how unsteady everything underneath her chest felt. She found herself reading the $200 figure over and over, some small, strange part of her mind fixating on the specific mundanity of it, that her entire future had been rerouted for the price of a modest dinner out. She asked him, when she finally looked up, how long he'd known. He told her 3 days, that he hadn't told Vanessa yet, that he genuinely didn't know what he was going to do next except that he owed her this conversation before he did anything else. "Why didn't you just call?" she asked, not accusing, genuinely curious. "Because this wasn't a phone call," he said. "You deserve to see it exactly the way I saw it. No summary, no version I could soften on my way over here." Maya asked him why he was doing this at all. Why not just confront Vanessa quietly and let the whole thing stay contained inside his own marriage? He said, simply, that she deserved to hear it from him and not from a family rumor mill that had gotten everything else about this wrong for over a decade, that he'd spent 3 sleepless nights imagining her finding out secondhand, years from now, the way she'd found out about the two of them getting together in the first place, and he couldn't let that happen to her twice. She didn't cry in that coffee shop, though she came close more than once, particularly when he described, without prompting, exactly what those 13 years had actually cost him. A version of his own life built on a foundation he'd never gotten to choose honestly. What she felt most, sitting across from a man she hadn't spoken to in 13 years, was something she hadn't expected. Not vindication, exactly, though there was some of that underneath everything else, but a strange, quiet grief for the version of her life that lie had erased before it ever had the chance to happen. She thought, sitting there, about the 9 years it had taken her to make partner, the boyfriend who'd left because she seemed to be waiting for something, the bare walls of her apartment she'd never quite gotten around to decorating, and wondered, not for the first time, but more sharply than ever before, how much of that quiet, unfinished quality to her life traced back to one photograph, and a roommate paid $200 to stand in the right place at the right time. She asked him one more question before they left. "What are you going to do about Vanessa?" He said he didn't know yet, only that he couldn't unknow what he now knew, and that whatever came next, he needed her to understand it hadn't been her fault, not for one single day of the 13 years he'd spent believing otherwise. Vanessa had noticed the distance too, over those same 3 days, though she'd told herself it was the work deadline he claimed, or ordinary marital weather, the kind of quiet stretch every long marriage moves through occasionally without it meaning anything. Still, some old, familiar unease had crept back in by the second night, a feeling she hadn't let herself sit with in years, the specific, low-grade dread of a secret that had been buried so long she'd almost convinced herself it had stopped being a secret at all, just something that had simply happened once, long ago, to different people. She caught herself, that second night, standing in front of the bathroom mirror longer than she needed to, unable to name exactly what she was bracing for, only that she was bracing. He confronted Vanessa 3 nights later, after the kids were asleep, laptop open between them on the desk in the study she rarely used. He'd rehearsed the opening line a dozen times on his drive home and abandoned all of them the moment he actually sat down across from her, ending up simply turning the screen around and saying nothing at all, letting her read it the way Maya had. She tried, for the first several minutes, to explain it away, a joke that had gotten out of hand, something she barely remembered doing, context he was missing. "It was so long ago," she said. "I don't even remember exactly what happened, Malik. It was 13 years. "Explain the $200, he said. She didn't have an answer for that one. Something in her face changed when she understood there wasn't a version of this she could talk her way out of. And for the first time in 13 years of marriage, Malik watched his wife stop performing entirely, watched the calculation drop away, and something rawer take its place. Not quite remorse, he would tell Maya later, so much as the particular panic of someone who has just watched their whole foundation give out beneath them. She didn't cry, not at first. She sat very still, staring at the screen, and when she finally spoke again, her voice had none of its usual polish left in it. "I was 26, she said, as though the number itself might explain something. "I watched her get everything I ever wanted, and I wanted one thing that was supposed to be hers. Just once." Malik asked her if she'd ever, in 13 years, planned to tell him. She said no, quietly, and that admission, more than the photos themselves, more than the $200, was the thing he found he couldn't get past. Not the lie itself, but the fact that she had built an entire life on top of it and never once, in over a decade, felt the pull to set it right. The marriage didn't end that night, not officially, but Malik understood, sitting in that study, that it had already ended the moment he read that thread 3 days earlier. What followed was months of a slow, grinding, unwinding, separate rooms, then separate finances, then the actual paperwork. All of it moving at the particular exhausting pace of two people trying to divide a decade built on a foundation one of them had poured in secret. Telling the children was the hardest part, harder in some ways than the confrontation itself. Their daughter, 12 by then, asked the question neither of them had a clean answer for. Why now? After everything had seemed fine for as long as she could remember. Malik told her only that some things take a long time to come to light, and that it wasn't anything either she or her brother had done. Their son, younger and less inclined to ask questions, mostly wanted to know if he'd still see his mother every week, and Malik promised him he would, a promise he intended to keep regardless of anything else that had happened between the adults in the house. Vanessa never fully explained why she'd done it, not in any way that made sense even to herself. The closest she came, in one conversation Malik relayed to Maya months later, was admitting she'd wanted, just once in her life, to be the sister who got the thing everyone assumed would always go to Maya. A confession that answered the what without ever quite touching the deeper question of why it had needed to be that particular thing, at that particular cost, kept secret for that particular length of time. Maya and Malik didn't fall back into each other the way it might happen in a story built for a tidier ending. Too much time had passed. Too much of both their lives had grown in directions the other hadn't been present for. What they built instead, slowly, over the following year, was something more like friendship first, long conversations that didn't need to resolve into anything, a rebuilding of trust between two people who'd both, in different ways, been robbed of a decade by the same lie. They started meeting for coffee every few weeks, then more often, conversations that ranged from careful and formal in the early months to something looser and easier as the year went on. Malik told her about his kids, cautiously at first, unsure whether that territory was hers to be invited into, and Maya found herself asking follow-up questions she meant genuinely, curious about two children who existed because of the same lie that had once devastated her, a complexity she never fully resolved but learned to hold without it curdling into resentment. Maya told him, in turn, about the library she'd designed, the partnership she'd made, the version of her life she'd built entirely on her own once she stopped waiting for an explanation that never came. He listened the way he'd always listened, the trait that had drawn her to him in the first place, still intact after everything. Whether it becomes something more, neither of them rushes to say out loud, and neither of them, for the first time in a long time, feels the need to. There's a version of the future where they end up together, and a version where they end up simply being two people who helped each other close a wound that had stayed open far longer than either of them deserved, and both of them, at this point, seem equally at peace with either outcome. Their mother handled it differently than their father did, less anger than a kind of quiet, grinding grief over having spent 13 years unknowingly reinforcing the very dynamic that had made the lie possible in the first place. She called Maya one evening, months after everything came out, and apologized. Not for anything specific, she said, but for every talent show and celebration dinner and small, uneven moment across 3 decades that had taught one daughter she came second and the other that she never had to work quite as hard to be loved. Maya hadn't expected the apology and found, once it came, that she needed it more than she'd realized. A small closing of a much older account that had nothing directly to do with Malik or the photos at all. Vanessa, in the aftermath, lost more than the marriage. Their parents, once they learned the full extent of it, struggled to look at her the same way, particularly their father, who Maya later heard had barely spoken to Vanessa in the months following the divorce beyond what was necessary to arrange time with his grandchildren. The wary, watchful love that had defined her relationship with Maya for most of their lives finally, quietly, gave out completely, not in a dramatic final argument, but in the simple absence of any further contact between them, and ending with no scene attached to it at all, which felt, to Maya, like the only fitting way for something built on 13 years of silence to finally end. Vanessa moved out of state a year later, started over somewhere nobody knew the story, though the story, in the particular way these things travel through families, followed her anyway. A cousin's offhand comment at a wedding 2 years later. A family group chat that went quiet whenever her name came up. She took a job at a firm 2 states away, rebuilt a small, quiet life around her new city, and by all appearances never remarried, though whether that was choice or consequence, nobody in the family felt close enough to her anymore to ask. She kept a relationship with her children, weekends and holidays worked out through lawyers, and by every account Malik heard secondhand, she was a good mother to them still, a fact that neither he nor Maya found easy to square with everything else they now knew about her, and that they eventually, separately, stopped trying to square it all. Some people, Maya decided somewhere in that first year, simply contained more than one true thing at once, and she no longer needed the arithmetic of it to come out even. There was a moment, about 8 months after that first coffee shop meeting, when Maya found herself telling Malik the story of the talent show, the violin piece she'd practiced for 6 weeks, the car ride home where their mother talked only about Vanessa's 2 rehearsals. She hadn't told anyone that story in almost 20 years. Malik listened without interrupting, the way he always had, and when she finished, he said only that it explained a lot, not about Vanessa, but about how long Maya had been quietly building a case for herself that nobody else had ever bothered to hear. She hadn't thought of it that way before. Sitting across from him, she realized the 13 years hadn't just been about a fiancé and a lie. They'd been the latest, loudest chapter in something that had started decades earlier, in a house where being right had never once been enough to also be believed. If you asked Maya today what she took from all of it, she wouldn't tell you it was closure, exactly, though she got a version of that too. She'd tell you it was proof of something she'd suspected her whole life and never had the evidence to say out loud, that the sister who never made a scene had been right to trust her own read of a room, even when everyone around her, for over a decade, insisted she was imagining things. She'd tell you, too, that the hardest part was never the lie itself, but the 13 years of silently wondering if she'd simply been unlucky or unlikable, or somehow responsible for her own life falling apart, when the truth, the whole time, was that someone she trusted had made a choice, once, and then spent over a decade protecting it instead of undoing it. 2 years after that first coffee shop meeting, Maya stood at the opening of a new community center she'd designed, the kind of project she'd once told Malik, half joking on one of their early walks together, that she dreamed of getting to build someday. He was there, near the back of the small crowd, having come at her invitation rather than assumption, and when she caught his eye across the room mid-ribbon cutting, she felt something settle in her chest that had taken 13 years and one accidental laptop discovery to finally arrive at. Not an ending exactly, and not quite a beginning either, but something more like proof that a life interrupted by someone else's lie could still, eventually, find its own way back to solid ground. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to psycheTalesTv for more stories about the truths that take years to surface, and tell us in the comments what you would have done in Maya's position once the truth finally reached you. Before you go, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Take care of yourself. I'll see you in the next one.